Well, if you ever meet a leprechaun, you need to have rules just in case, and one of them is that you don't take their food.
All right, welcome back to Mind Matters, everyone. I know it's been a while, but we are back, and I've got a special guest, Joshua Cutchin. I've been reading Joshua's books for a few years now. Let me just hold this up for you. Oh, let me get my mic out of the way. I don't have all of his books, but here's my stack of Joshua books. I'm missing three or four, um, but Joshua, you are an author and a musician. Maybe just is that good enough? Is that a good enough bio? Or let us know a little bit more about you, or does that kind of capture you?
Yeah, I mean that's fine as far as I'm concerned. No, yeah, I like to say that I'm an outcast wherever I go, you know. So
Yeah,
I when I'm in the when I'm on a gig, the other musicians are like, "So what's up with this UFO thing, Josh?" And then when I'm, with my UFO people or my paranormal people, they go, "So you play the tuba? Like you play jazz tuba?"
yeah,
Yeah, so it's kind of it's a very unique combination. I used to say that I was the only tuba playing Fortean until I found out that Dan Aykroyd plays the tuba. So I guess
oh
maybe
wow,
not. But yeah, those are the two sides of my life is playing basically New Orleans music here in Atlanta. I'm
that's cool.
sort of the first call jazz tuba player here in Atlanta. And when I get tired of that, I refocus on writing books about the paranormal and all these topics. Most of what I do, I would say, is from a comparativist, sort of pan-paranormalist perspective. Because I do have a suspicion, I don't know anything, but I do have a suspicion that all of these topics are at the very least interrelated, if not, quite frankly, different parts of the same elephant. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 for sure. And well, we'll get into some of the specifics of that because you have a cool in at least one or two of your books. You state it really well when you're talking about the extraterrestrial hypothesis and the fairy faith hypothesis, right? But we'll hold off for that for just a second because I just want to give a little bit of background on the books themselves. So this was your first book, right? A Trojan Feast,
Yes,
10 years ago
yeah,
now.
10-year anniversary. It's hard to believe. Yeah.
And so leading up to this book, like how did you come to write this book in the first place?
By
Like,
being a
yeah,
strange kid, I guess, it's like
yeah,
I was always into I like to tell people I was a creature feature kid, so the first film I
hmm
ever remember was the 1933 King Kong. So Ray Harryhausen, Stan Winston, those were sacred names as a child growing up. And anything that involved that sort of, monster effects were always was always appealing to me. I grew up in a household that was very open to anything being real, quite frankly. I mean, I did grow up in a Christian
hmm
household, but it wasn't like a restrictive Christian
hmm
household, and. So it wouldn't be out of the question for me to pick up a book from the library on any of these topics, from ghosts to Bigfoot to UFOs. Although for the longest time, most of what I was focused on was the Bigfoot stuff. And as it turns out,
hmm
my dad apparently always had an interest in in Bigfoot as well. And so it was just something that sort of played in the background all my life. There's still over there on my bookshelf a copy of Jerome Clark's The Unexplained, which is a great fun
yep,
compendium of book that like my mom had to repair with packing tape,
like
clear
duct tape.
packing tape. Yeah, so
Yeah,
it's the same copy I've had since middle school. And so then I got my first desk job at the University of Georgia in 2012. Um, Public relations, public affairs director for the School of Music, because I thought I was going to do some sort of music journalism thing. That's a whole nother story and why that didn't work out. But I had this desk job that was about an hour away, each way, an hour there and an hour back, and that to me was like really the Wild West or golden age of paranormal podcasting because there were enough shows that like you could keep up with that whole ecosystem. Nowadays, it's just impossible
yeah,
to keep track of it all.
yeah.
But so I started really listening to a bunch of different shows, and that's really what fired back up this interest of mine in the paranormal and in these topics. And so was probably around 2013, 2014, not long after I got that job, actually. My sisters-in-law got me an Amazon gift card for my birthday or for Christmas or something like that. And I bought a copy of J. Robert Alley's Raincoast Sasquatch. And in that book, which is a great book, he mentions that one of the Alaskan tribes has a Bigfoot analog called the Bakwus, and if you accept food from the Bakwus, you are trapped with the Bakwus forever. And I said, that's really that sounds a lot like Western European fairy folklore. Like, why is that so on the nose and so specific? And I sat around for a couple of weeks, and I was like, somebody should really write a book on that. Like, kept on waiting, like, for Nick Redfern to announce that he was going to write that or
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
And it just didn't happen. So it's like, it's that moment where you go, oh, is it me? Like, is this a thing that I'm being asked to do? So I feel like it's 10 years later I can admit to this. I basically wrote a Trojan Feast during the summer of my last year there at the School of Music, because summers as staff at a university, it gets very dead.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so I more or less wrote the book there, and ushered it through the publication process. And I think that I quit that job within a week of a Trojan Feast being published. And it's
Nice.
not like it's not like it was like, oh, I felt like I was going to embark on this new lifestyle of being able to to live off of this stuff. But it was just more of an inflection point in my life. Like, I want to do something different. So then
Mhm.
I went back into my music and doing more teaching and writing, and those two things, keeping them, trying to push those two things at the same time. And now, about 6 months ago, my wife quit her job, and we're just relying to varying degrees of reliability on me playing music and writing and doing things like this,
Mhm.
some teaching in this capacity and stuff. So, um, yeah, it's a strange, circuitous lifestyle that I don't know if I would have ever predicted. There's
Mhm.
I do
Mhm.
recall, like, asking my father at one point, like, can I be a cryptozoologist when I grow up? And in his most loving way was like, no, Josh, that's not a thing. But
It's
I
not
kind of got
real.
there. Yeah, right. I kind of got there. And it's funny how these things work out, because I was on the classical music route with my playing, and um, like, nothing sounds less appealing to me than sitting in the back of an orchestra counting rests, like I would have been doing if I'd
Yeah.
gotten my way. So I didn't get my way, and I got what I
Mhm.
want.
Good.
Cue the Rolling Stones song. Um, but yeah, I'm playing New Orleans music, which has always been a really close to my heart. A lot of improvisational styles, which is so much more fun. And
Yeah.
you know, I have the strangest names in my cell phone now of people whose books that I read when I was in middle school. It's so surreal to me. So that's sort of a thumbnail sketch of my journey.
That's awesome. So the book was A Trojan Feast, and the subtitle is The Food and Drink Offerings of Aliens, Fairies, and Sasquatch.
Mhm.
So so you mentioned this, reading that one little bit from that Bigfoot book. Did you have to did you already have a lot of those stories kind of in the back of your mind, or did you kind of reach out afresh and then go looking for them, or was it a bit of both?
It's so odd. For some reason, that a lot of that fairy folklore, whenever I would hear it on those podcasts and such, um, which I still maintain is a great way to get an education about these topics, is to just listen, listen,
Yeah.
listen, 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 and try to store
Mhm.
some of that in your memory banks. But for whatever reason, whenever I'd hear that fairy stuff, it was so it's something about it seemed to me so uncanny in the actual sense of the word, and so eldritch, and quite frankly, like, almost disturbing, that I think all of that just stuck like iron
Mhm.
filings to a magnet in my head. And one
Yeah.
and but what even stranger still, though, is one of the things that I used to have conversations with my wife. She was like, "Why are you listening to this stuff all the time?" And I'm like, "Well, if you ever meet a leprechaun, you need to know that you don't take food." I remember having this conversation with her,
Yep.
being like, you need to have rules just in case. And one of them is that you don't take their food. And so, like, that food taboo was the thing that, like, that was the biggest iron filing that stuck to the magnet in my head, right? Um,
Mhm.
and that was the thing that ended up jumping out at me. And it was the thing that no one had really done a comparison on
Yeah.
at that point. And don't get me wrong, like 10 years later, there's a lot I would change about a Trojan Feast and a lot of
Hmm.
new perspectives I would bring to it. I'm not sure it would be any better, but it would definitely be longer. Um, but that was sort of like one of those moments where I realized that my pathway into this domain was going to be paved by looking at tiny details as opposed to some sort of
Yeah.
10,000-foot view of the topic. Because
Yeah.
I think that trying to come up with a giant explanation is something of a fool's errand, even though I've kind of done that in my last two works. I think that really going back to the um, smaller, consistent details across phenomena is where I would like to return to in the coming years. You
Yeah, and that's what like that's one of what I think is the kind of main features that draw me toward your work is that you have that attention to detail, but then you look at it from like a variety of different let's say different lenses or fields, right?
know?
So you read and quote the UFO literature, close encounters, that kind of thing,
Right.
folklore and world folklore. So not just European folklore, but and fairy folklore, but kind of fairy folklore all over the world, and then cryptozoology and the paranormal. So you're reaching out into all of these different fields, and I'm sure I'm sure that probably like it's a bit better now, but maybe you can let me know at the time that you released it, was it still the case that a lot of these fields were really siloed?
Yeah, I do think,
Because
yeah,
Bigfoot people don't like UFOs, UFO people didn't like Bigfoot
right.
for a long
and
time,
we
right?
and we all live in glass houses, which is the
Yeah,
funniest part, you know.
yeah,
But yeah, I think it's gotten better. It was a little bit, well, it's gotten well, we can unpack this a little bit. But yeah, I don't. I'm still to this day kind of baffled when people are like, well, I'm not really into the ghost thing, or I'm not into the UFO thing. I'm like, why would you be into all this stuff? And
yeah,
I think that if you do this right, and I guess I've got to assume that I'm doing it quote unquote right, but like I think if you do this right, you end up just becoming voraciously curious about all these mysteries, you know.
yeah.
So when I jumped on the scene and 10 years ago, there was, I think it coincided with sort of a thawing of the UFO question, and there was a lot more dialogue about looking at things like altered states of consciousness and what they might play in
Hmm.
regards to the UFO thing, which again is something that had been around since the counterculture, but
Yeah,
was just finally starting to get talked about by ufologists. And it's the funniest thing. I think about this now. It's the funniest thing that I feel like that was reaching a real saturation point, and then the New York Times article drops, and everybody's talking about propulsion technologies and anti-gravity and stuff again, right? But that has self-corrected a bit as well now, and I think that like it's kind of gotten hard to find someone who is of that sort of Stan Friedman sort of
yeah.
ufological
Like
persuasion now. Like,
nuts and bolts.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
you've got people like Rich Dolan, talking about consciousness playing some sort of role, even though he's still on the extraterrestrial bandwagon. So that I think is a pretty important sea change. So I think that there's a lot more cross pollination. Again, it's just it's similar with where the footprints end, right? The Bigfoot books that I did with Tim Renner. Um, it's a chicken or the egg sort of thing. Like I think that some people would credit Tim and me for bringing paranormal Bigfoot more to the forefront of cryptozoologists' thoughts, but at the same time, like I think we just jumped on a wave that was destined to happen
yeah.
anyway. I think it was trending in that direction, and that there's been a thawing of perspectives in that field as well, being more open to these other topics. I think it's not where it
Hmm.
should be, but
Yeah.
it's getting better. Yeah.
It's kind of like it's kind of like any scientific field, right? I think part of it is the old guard dying off and the getting some new blood in it because um
Yeah. Yeah, I
like
mean, it's
but
yeah.
yeah,
Well, it's one of those things where like the fringe is often. I've heard this. I've heard this quoted around a couple of different places, but it's like the fringe of any field is like 90% of the time incorrect, right? But the only developments in a field also come from that 10% that isn't correct. You
yeah.
know what I mean? Yeah. So I think that's a big part of it too. Yeah.
Well, you kind of stayed in the same vein for your second book, which was the Brimstone Deceit. Not this one. So the first one was on food offerings. This one was on smells. So an in-depth examination of supernatural scents, otherworldly odors, and monstrous miasmas. That one, did that was there a similar kind of genesis for this one as with Trojan Feast, where it was like something happened, you're like, okay, I've got to write this book, or was it just like, food smells, was it just kind of
Yeah,
like, I'm
nobody
just going to
likes
move
that
on to
book.
that?
Nobody likes that book. No, I think before my novel came around, it was my worst selling book. But it's kind of in some ways my favorite because it is so just like what the heck. Yeah, it was one of those things. Once I realized that, I mean, again, the whole genesis of a Trojan Feast was like a bolt out of the blue, but this was workshopped a little bit more, and it was like, well, what do you write about next? Because we don't need another discussion of Roswell. We don't need another Rendlesham book. Like we don't need any of these things, right?
Yeah.
So it is this, quite frankly, kind of like a formulae that I think is bubbled up in my head, which is like read all these books and then look for the thing that people mention in passing a lot, or they might
Yeah.
dedicate a paragraph to, but they never dive in on. And
Mhm.
I say it's a formula. Maybe it's just the fact that those things jump out to me. But it's like, hey, I've seen that in so many other places. Like, why is this being mentioned in passing here? Like, why isn't this something that has been given
Yeah.
more attention? Like, I think every aspect of of our sensory input demands a scrutiny like this. And I've got like five other books that are started sitting on my hard drive that sort of take a similar approach right now. But yeah, that was one of those things where it's like sulfur, 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 and like, well, okay, what does that mean? Like, what has anybody really bothered to unpack that? Because people will just say, "Oh, it's like demons," and move on. It's like, okay, well, but why? Why is it? Why is that smell associated with demons? And why do we have allusions to sulfur and sulfur compounds appearing across all paranormal manifestations? And to my surprise, like there were more variations on sulfur compounds than I thought that would manifest. Like, of course, we're getting now a bit into the weeds in terms of what people mean when they say that they're smelling sulfur and, and all those
Right. Right.
things, right? But I guess what I'm getting at is that like when people say, "Oh, it smelled like natural gas," well, there are certain compounds in natural gas that are specifically added to alert you to it leaking that cause an
Their
odor.
presence. Yeah.
Yeah, that are mercaptans, which are based on thiols, and they derive their stinkiness from sulfur. So it's like it kept on coming
Mhm.
back to this sulfur thing over and over again. So that was, once I saw that was a trend, I was like, okay, well, there's meat on these bones. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it was, well, in the book that I published recently, I quoted from your work. I can't remember which book I quoted it from, if it was Brimstone Deceit or the Bigfoot books, but I just strung together
Yeah, I saw.
like 20 or
Yeah,
30
yeah,
descriptions
yeah, yeah.
of what Bigfoot smells like, and like some of
They're
the things that
hilarious.
just, they're hilarious
Yeah,
what people come up with, right?
yeah.
And it's, yeah, I just find it hilarious
Well,
and kind of endearing.
well, and
Yeah.
it makes that scene in Anchorman like all the more prescient, where they're describing as cologne, and like they're like, it smells like
Yeah.
a what is it, a dirty diaper filled with Indian food, and like this and that and the other, and burning rubber and something, and that the ultimate one is, oh, it smells like Bigfoot's dick, right? And it's
Yeah.
like, no, that's accurate, because like the types of descriptions that you will see from Bigfoot witnesses are about that descriptive. And
Yeah.
part of it's because we just have so much trouble putting smells into language, right? I mean, it's just not something that,
Yeah. Yeah.
we have all this language to help us grasp what images are. But if there's a truly even novel images, right? But if there's a truly novel
Hmm.
smell, like you're just trying to compare it, aspects of it, to other things. Like you can't
Yeah.
put a pin in it, the same way.
Yeah. That's why, like when I read the descriptions, like I must have I don't have a very big smell vocabulary, right? There are
No
a
one
ton of
does.
smells that I
Yeah.
haven't smelled before, right? So I'm reading these descriptions and I'm like, well, what? what does that actually smell like,
But
right?
yeah,
I kind of want to, I want like a scratch and sniff to be able to
right.
see what's
Well,
going on with these
and
things.
it's this is sort of we alluded to this a couple of moments ago, but it gets even worse in the fact that we like even when we do have words for certain smells, we don't use them consistently from person to person. Like,
Right. Or
there's
even correctly.
people interchanging musky and musty, like those are completely different concepts. A lot of times you go back into you know 19th century literature, and ozone and brimstone are used interchangeably or switched around, and
Mhm.
brimstone and sulfur, and we can't even agree on the spelling of sulfur, right? um and the fact that people say, oh, it smelled like this, when they actually meant a completely different, like, oh, it smelled like sulfur. Well, is that hydrogen sulfide or is that sulfur dioxide? Because like gunpowder and rotten eggs, some of the same, compositional components, but very different smells, and both appear in
Yeah.
these stories. So, um, yeah, I'm proud of that one. It's a bit of an odd duck, but I'm still proud of that one.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, in that sense, your focus on the small details that might get ignored or might get excluded completely from other accounts. Like there might be a person with an experience that experienced one of those details, but they just never thought it was important, or the investigator or whoever just didn't interview them and ask them the right question. Right. That's one
Yeah.
of the reasons I really like John Keel,
Mhm.
is because he had some great proposals back in the '60s for like for investigators. He was like, you have to ask all these questions. You've got to get into their personal details. Like if you dig hard enough, you're going to find all kinds of stuff that they didn't even think to tell you about. And
Yeah. Well, and sometimes in my more playful moments, I'm like, what if the secret to unlocking the replicability of all paranormal phenomena is that someone wore a purple shirt on a bank
yeah,
holiday and then stepped out at 12:30 in the rain? Just like some sort of
like right foot
hyper
first.
specific, yeah, hyper specific ritual or something that unlocks it all. And yeah, that's
And we just
yeah.
can't find it because no one thinks
Right,
to find those details, right?
and why would you? Yeah, but yeah. I have such a soft spot for John Keel, and it's been
Yeah.
really startling and humbling, quite frankly, to me, the number of times where I think I've come up with some sort of new novel idea, and then I'm rereading Keel, and it's like, oh no, he was there first. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. And he was there first for so many things. Like I have the same. I don't necessarily have the ideas myself, but I'll think of what I'm thinking of as a newish idea that might be, in certain writers or that's going around, right? And then I'll be reading some of Keel's old obscure articles, and there's just like hundreds of new and interesting ideas that
Yes.
were like way ahead of their time.
Yeah.
Like he was just, I don't know how he did it, but
Yeah, I mean, this
yeah, he was amazing.
something that I point out in Ecology of Souls, which looks at death and all these different modalities. And I think I'm not going to say I am, but I might be the first person to have pointed this out. Everybody was sort of celebrating Kenneth Ring's comparison of near-death experiences to UFO abductions,
Yeah.
and not taking anything away from Dr. Ring's work. I'm a big fan, but it wasn't even Kenneth Ring who made that comparison first. It was Keel back in like the 60s. In one
Oh
of his
wow.
newsletters, he talks about like he refers to a similarity between UFO contact and death dreams. And of course now, in terms of parapsychology, we talk about death dreams as being like dream visitations from dead loved ones. But as he's explaining it, you're like, oh no, he's talking about near-death experiences and how they sound like
Oh
UFO
wow.
contact in like the 60s or 70s or something like that. Probably the 70s, I think. And it's just like, wow, like so far ahead of his time. It's
Yeah.
astounding, absolutely astounding.
Yeah. Crazy. Well, probably this is the one I've mined the most for information um, so far of your books, because I haven't read all of them. I'll let you know which ones I haven't read yet. But so Thieves in the Night. So this was number 3, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abductions. And I just love this book. Like I I can't remember if I wrote this anywhere, but I consider it the best alien abduction book, that I've ever read. Even though it's not really an
Right,
alien
right.
abduction book. It's much more than that. But there's just so many cool things in that. Not I never really had an interest in um in fairy folklore or most folklore,
Mhm.
you know, not enough to actually go and research a bunch
Mhm.
about it. Like for just like for some topics, I just prefer to find someone that knows what they're talking about, and then I'll read one of their books,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And you know, and and so this kind of pretty much like a lot of the stuff was new to me, just except for the stuff that might have just filtered to me through pop culture and just or even just culture in general. And you get into like some very interesting territory, and one of the most interesting things, well, one of the most interesting things to me, and probably one that's kind of that was and kind of still is topical, is just the little chapter you did on missing 411 cases, right?
yeah.
Because David Paulides is really kind of famous for not giving any conclusions for or hypotheses for what's going on in his cases, right? You've got an idea that he's got an idea of what's going on, but he just, he doesn't like going there. And but in some of his books, in one of the volumes, he lists a few of the a few of the correlations with, I'm pretty sure, fairy folklore, but just like three or four, or a handful. But in just that short chapter, you kind of go through like, I don't know, 20 or 30
There's a lot of
missing
things.
411
Yeah, there
features,
are a lot of things. Yeah.
and you point out that every single one of them has an analog in fairy folklore. That And so I'll just paraphrase you. You put it that the only tradition, like the only lens that offers a complete,
Yeah.
a complete overlap with the missing 411 phenomenon is fairy abduction, and fairy
Yeah.
folklore.
Yeah, and
So it's like, wow, that's pretty
I
crazy.
mean, I think that still stands true today. I have to be self-aware enough because I'm not sure if it's in there. It might be in there, but I mentioned that the missing 411 phenomena is a Rorschach blot, right? So like whatever you're into,
Oh
that's
yeah,
what you're gonna see.
yeah, yeah.
I'm fully
Hmm.
aware of the irony of me saying, "Oh, it corresponds to fairy folklore," because that's my own Rorschach blot, right? But I do think that like if you apply the lens of UFO phenomenon, it's which I mean, are we splitting hairs here? Is that the fairy thing, right? But if you apply the lens of UFO phenomenon, then like, why are extraterrestrials making it rain? Why or how? Are they making it rain
Yeah,
during these search and rescues? Similarly with Bigfoot, like if you adopt that flesh and blood perspective of Bigfoot, like why is that? Why are they making it rain? How are they making it rain? But just looking at that one specific thing, like that influence of weather, like not only is it something that the fairies could do, but it was something that like people like it was one of those almost like baseline say baseline fundamental assumptions about fairies wherever you go is
hmm,
that they control weather and elements, and that sort of thing.
yeah,
That they even traveled on storms. So it's not only the fact that it covers all those criteria, but it's also like the criteria of missing 411 that the fairy folklore covers is like fundamental stuff about
yeah.
about fairy belief and warnings against interacting with the fairies, and that's what I always found really quite compelling about it.
Hmm. And well, one of the reasons that stood out to me is because this might not be true, but it's easy to look at fairy folklore as kind of just weird legends and things that people believed in the past, or that that peasants believe in or
Right,
something. It's easy to discount it,
right.
right? Now, of course, there's more going on to it, and there's more going on to all kinds of folklore than just that. And especially with fairy folklore, well, where just like UFO accounts, like there are in maybe not in well, you can correct me if I'm wrong, maybe not in living memory, but in living memory of a lot of the big researchers, like at the early 1900s, of actual accounts, not just like an urban legend, like this thing, like this thing happened in this town to this lady, and the lady never existed, and it's just a story that's gotten passed around, right?
Right.
That's not the type of thing. It's like, this happened to my grandma. My grandma told me that this happened, or something like that. Or this
Yeah.
lady is telling you
I
directly,
mean, yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah,
And that missing 411 is like that. It's like, these are real cases, a real mystery,
right.
and without an explanation. And so the fact that that there is that correlation is just what to me was like, oh wow, there's a mystery that can correlate that well to an entire kind of tradition or folklore. I
Yeah,
just thought
yeah.
that was
Well, no,
cool.
I would agree with that. That's the um. There's something about some of those firsthand fairy sort of accounts that is really confronting in sort of its immediacy. You read something like Evans Wentz's Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, and his informants are all like, oh, Bobby O'Malley down the road had this happen to him, and and this and the other. And I can't really speak to this authoritatively, but I certainly have the sense that not a lot has changed for certain rural Irish populations to this
Yeah.
day. I mean, you could say the same thing for
Mm.
Appalachian populations, right?
Yeah.
But like, I remember like being in a pub in Dublin and talking to like a 20 something, and they're like, no, I don't believe in fairies, but I'm terrified of them. Like, I'm not gonna, you're not going to be able to pay me to go sleep in a fairy fort. And so there are people who do have these stories. And I have speculated that I think that's part of the reason that that people in places like Appalachia, people talk about West Virginia. Like, why is West Virginia so haunted, right, with UFOs and cryptids and
Yeah.
stuff? And it's like, well, they're kind of living like I'm not going to say that they're living in a pre-industrial sort of capacity, but like you have these people who are living close to family members in isolated locations. Like this family has this holler in West Virginia that they live in, and they rely on each other for things. They walk to their neighbor for sugar and butter. In a lot of these locations, still to this day, internet and phone service are spotty. It's something that's much more in contact with community and with land. And I
Mm.
wonder if that's the reason why some places like West Virginia and, by extension, parts of rural Ireland, which I don't believe were fully electrified until like the 40s, if memory serves, why they just had more of those types of experiences, because everything was, um, there's not only a sense of community, but a sense of being more closely tied with the land. And
Yeah.
there's this really wonderful there's some wonderful correspondence between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, where Tolkien is remarking on the fact that he thinks that people don't see um, fairies and elementals and things like that because they're not consuming of the land where they live. So they're putting into their body all these things from all
Mm.
across the world, and they're not sort of imbibing of the earth where they are, so that naturally is separating them from that. And I sort of wonder about that too. Sorry, it was a little bit of a digression there, but
No, no,
yeah.
no problem. Well, that mention of the missing 401 just makes me want to ask. You mentioned that you like the details and avoiding kind of the big theories, but I want to ask at this point in your life, if someone were to ask you, well, what do you think's going on with fairies and UFOs and like
Right.
aliens? Like what like is this just kind of like an if someone who might not know you, is this just kind of an intellectual curiosity and you look at these all these cases and you're looking for connections? Like what do you actually think about it?
Right.
Like cuz that sometimes it's a question that would kind of make me uncomfortable in certain in certain situations in certain company, right? Well, you really want to know what I really think? But like how do you answer that when you're having a conversation like with your musician friends and they're
Yeah.
like, what's up with this stuff,
Well,
right?
it's really interesting because something I've noticed about my musician friends is they aren't necessarily the ones who, I mean, they're drinking of the same cultural well that we are in terms of like the extraterrestrial hypothesis and whatnot.
Mhm.
But I can distinctly remember two different conversations I've had, after gigs or on gigs when this topic has come up, and I've said something like, "Yeah, I know this sounds kind of a little bit hard to wrap your head around, but like, there are a lot of similarities between UFO contact and shamanic initiations," and they've been like, "Oh yeah, that totally makes sense," something along
Yeah,
those
yeah,
lines,
yeah.
like a complete openness and willingness, right? Um, my problem is when people get really hung up because my books aren't going to convince anybody of um,
Yeah.
the reality of these things, and that's
Right.
oftentimes the thing that I'm least interested in. So like whenever people like are
Mhm.
trying to get me to like provide best evidence for this thing existing, it's like no, that's not what I'm here for. Which is why I have met some outright skeptics who are avowed skeptics who are still receptive to what I do, and the reason for that is because they realize, like I do, because I don't believe everything that I talk about, right? I believe a lot of it. I don't believe everything that I talk about, but I've met some skeptics that I'm very friendly with who don't share that same level of belief for the reality of these things, but they still realize that even if it's all hogwash, it still tells us something important about ourselves, right?
Yeah.
And you know, I think maybe the reason that musicians have always been more receptive to that is because they're probably more likely to have taken drugs. Like
Yeah, yeah.
they get the altered states of consciousness thing and how something can be real and not real at the same time and all that stuff. Um, but yeah, I mean, like it, it's so this is I've had this conversation with friends before, right? It's the gun held to your head question. Like if a gun is held to your head, what do you say is going on with all this, right?
Hmm.
And where I've sort of settled now is that um these phenomena are quite a bit, if not wholly, about us. And I know that sounds anthropocentric and maybe narcissistic on a species level, but like I suspect that we are something unique in the sense that we have a capacity to interrogate the system in which we're embedded, right? And I think that sort of reflective act of turning around and looking at our reality and looking at ourselves, I kind of wonder if that doesn't generate some sort of feedback loop um, in the fabric of reality that causes us to see these things. And I'm not necessarily saying that these apparitions of all sorts of cryptids and UFOs and ghosts are necessarily generated from ourselves, but I guess what I am getting at is that um, those distinctions start to lose a lot of importance after a certain
Hmm.
point, right? And so you do get into this sort of Henri Corbin imaginal sort of stratum, which I think is probably the same stratum that we go and we die. None of this
Hmm.
is very well defined because I try to a phrase that I use in my new book is that I like to hold ideas instead of closed-handed, open-handed,
Yeah, yeah. Yep.
and there are very few things that I'm like, no, this is exactly what it is. There are more things where I'm like, I'm not sure, but this is sort of the way it feels. Felt more than deduced is sort of where I'm winding up nowadays. A
Yeah.
lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that sounds, correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds, well, no, I'm not going to say it sounds like the Jungian interpretation. I'm just going to say that, like, a Jungian interpretation, right, is that these are kind of projections
Hmm.
of the collective unconscious. And then there's kind of two versions that I've seen of the Jungian interpretation, and I think he himself gave both of them. And one would be that they're kind of like hallucinations, right? That this
Right.
is like a dream. But then the other is that they're real at the same time,
Right.
because the Jung. A lot of people think that Jung was just strictly the former, but he actually, like, I've seen bits of his writing. I can't remember if it was a letter or an article where he said, but we have to take into account that, like, when he's talking about UFOs or flying saucers, he said we have to take into account that these are real physical objects at the same time
Right.
because they show up on radar and et cetera, et
Right.
cetera. So it's almost it's almost like a real hallucination, maybe.
Well, yeah.
Um,
I think that you've got public Jung and private Jung.
yeah,
You got pre-read book Jung and read book Jung. You know what I mean.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I think once you start like really taking a look at things like his invocation of the unus mundus and in psychoid processes and stuff, he's sort of driving at this exact same thing that I mentioned earlier, which is like there once you get down deep enough, the distinctions between physical and psychic or psyche are really hard to pull apart. Um, and this is something that in my latest book, Fourth Wall Phantoms, I spend some time at the end being like, okay, well, but at the end of the day, like, can archetypes become physicalized? Like, that's that's sort of the
right, right,
question that we're
yeah.
dealing with. And yeah, I mean, there is some ambivalence that Jung expressed. Um, at the same time, when you read the Red Book, you do have interactions with Elijah and Salome telling him in his active imagination, specifically they tell him, we are real and not symbols, so it's like, well, Jung might have kind of thought that, it doesn't get more explicit than that. Gregory Little, who's a researcher who I don't think gets enough love in terms of, people knowing about his work, has made an argument that it's this kind of complex argument that invokes telluric currents and the dark side of the Earth at night when magnetic forces are less.
Hmm.
Anyway, and argues that archetypes can become physicalized. And I don't know. I think just saying I
Yeah.
don't know is part of it. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of Jung in my approach in the sense that like these things that we're engaging with tap into such deep currents over and over again, so reliably, so predictably across cultures that like it does start to feel like there is something that has an externality or an autonomy from us. Now,
Hmm.
it can be sustained by us and still be sort of separate from us, if that makes any sense. And
Yeah.
that's sort of
And there can be an interaction and a reflection. Like it doesn't have to be like sometimes the word reflective is used like the reflective
right,
hypothesis that the phenomenon is reflecting
right,
our minds basically and our ideas and images. But that doesn't mean that it's not its own thing at the same time, right? It can
right.
be an interactive process that is
Well,
shaped by us,
and
but is also shaping us.
and that's a huge part of where my current thinking is going as well, which is the idea that everything is this cyclical dialogue, right? Like, and I mean everything, like
Yeah.
and this is sort of born out of Eric Wargo's work on retrocausality and time loops. I have a great amount of admiration for Eric's work on retrocausality, and I think some of it is just right. Quite frankly, I think some of it is some of it you can hold closed handedly, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I think that number one, I don't think that retrocausality is everything in the whole of the paranormal, and I also don't think it's solely exclusively relegated to our perception of time. I think it's everything. I think it's the types of characteristics that you see in encounters that seem like they started in fiction but then bleed their way into actual firsthand
Yeah.
accounts. But wait, I found an older account from 18 so and so where it first appeared. But wait, there was an older story from. And so you wind back up at like
Hmm.
petroglyphs and it's like
Yeah.
is this petroglyph art or is it a representation of is it art or is it testimony?
Yeah.
And you're like, I don't know.
Uh-huh.
But I think there's that reciprocity and that cyclicality that's embedded into the way that we experience these things, the way that we express these things, both in art and in terms of these first hand. Everything is, and if not like this loop or this dialogue, this sense of every win, of everything, like just being present in a simultaneity, all
Yeah.
at once
Yeah.
is where it leads me. And like I realize that like there's probably a lot of people who think I'm sniffing my own farts when I say something like that, right? But that just feels that just feels that comes from an earnest place when I say it. It's not me
Hmm.
trying to like sound smart. Like it feels like that. It's felt, not deduced, right? It feels like
Yeah.
that for me. That there's a in every win that we are in right now, and there is some sort of thin membrane between us and this imaginal soup where every idea that can be has been. I'm not necessarily talking about like a
Yeah.
separate timeline because I think that there's something sacred about the sacred timeline, right? To use some Marvel terminology. But like I do think that, coming back to that quote that's apocryphally attributed to Jung, I do think that ideas have people and people don't have ideas. Like I think that there are
Yeah.
things that have always existed, you know.
Yeah.
And so when you get the when you get a human, let's talk about, classical Forteana, like when you get a leather-soled boot crushing a trilobite in the fossil record, or you get the Baghdad battery, or you get all these things, it's just because it's every win. It's everything right here, always.
Mm. Hmm.
Is that
Yeah.
bullshit? I don't know.
Eh,
Like,
no, no,
like I,
no,
I say all
no.
that,
I don't think it's bullshit.
I say all that, and then I
But
step back and I'm like, okay, brass tacks. What the hell does that
but
mean?
hold on a sec.
Yeah.
Well, I think that like the world is a vast and complex place, and this is one of my other interests is philosophy. Now, I'm not a philosopher by any means, but my the philosophies that I'm most interested in are the kind of big picture philosophies, like Whitehead. Like Whitehead's probably one of my favorite philosophers, but then there's even like a modern guy like the controversial Chris Langan, cosmic cognitive theoretic model of the universe, and um, and they've got the way they describe reality is, I think, can accommodate what you were just describing about, and I think they're trying to get at that. Because both Whitehead and Langan and several others, right? If you look at just all the process philosophers, for instance, they're trying to get the biggest picture description of reality that will account for everything we could possibly, everything that we do experience or could possibly experience. And in doing so, you get to some weird places, like this idea of, well, I won't. I'll try not to get into the jargon, but kind of like what you described, this kind of grand imaginal realm of infinite possibilities that conscious beings, well, and any being with any degree of consciousness interacts with, and we as humans with a certain degree of cognition and imagination are able to interact with it, perhaps to a greater degree than like a worm or an ant,
Right.
but but that's what the paranormal is the parent well that might be too much of a definitive statement,
Right.
but it's that interaction with that part of reality, and it's a fundamental part of reality. So all of the anomalous experiences that are reported and that people have aren't anomalous.
Right.
They're part of the way they're part of the way they're part of the fabric of the universe, of reality itself, and it just tells us something about those experiences. Hint at something greater about reality than just all of the mundane experiences we have,
Right.
which tell us about reality, but not all of reality. A segment of reality.
Right. And it's
So
it's kind of like one
yeah,
of those things where, like, I think my heart is a panpsychist and my head is an idealist. Like, I think that's the
yeah,
direction that I get, that I think of all those sort of like current popular formulations of reality they're getting kicked about. I think idealism is probably the one that I resonate with the most. Um,
hmm
I guess I'm so bored of simulation theory. Don't even get me started.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, I think probably idealism is where it's at, which I think sort of I mean, that's probably the simplest way to encompass what we're
yeah.
talking about right now.
hmm
And again, but what do you do with that? Like what do you what is how is that applicable to your life? Do we get to wash our hands and go home and say, okay, well, that explains, Bigfoot and UFOs and stuff. I mean, your typical podcast audience, and not your show, but your typical podcast audience is going to be enraged by, like, okay, cool, idealism. Like, no, they're like, no,
Yeah, yeah,
I want to hear the
yeah.
stories. I want there to
Uh-huh.
be something. I want there to be something more to tease out of this. And sometimes, I just wonder, Harrison. I wonder if there is nothing more to tease out. Like, you get, like, what you see is what you get. You know,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
the UFO solely exists as a way to propagate the UFO story. Like, there's nothing else behind it. And I don't know if there. So in other words, I guess what I'm saying is I don't know if there's a there all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I do know. I personally know, and anybody listening may feel free to disagree. But I know that there's a there here. In me. From my vantage point, I know there's a there here in me. So I kind of wonder if um it's a bit like we're looking at a book and being like, and scrutinizing each of the 26 characters in every word and be like, what
Yeah.
does this one mean? What does this one? It doesn't mean a damn thing. It's the gestalt of it all put together and the space of meaning that's generated between you and the book. That's what it means. It doesn't mean, like, why are we stressing over the serifs on this letter K? It's like, it doesn't make any
Mm-hmm.
sense. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll find out when we die. Maybe
Yeah, maybe.
what it all means, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's
Well,
yeah.
no, go ahead.
No, I was gonna try to think of something witty to say, but I couldn't think of anything. So yeah.
Well, instead of a witticism, I want to cover just a couple more things to get through your career so far as a paranormal author. So you mentioned these books earlier.
Yeah.
So this is where the footprints. This is where the footprints end that you did with Tim Renner. 2 volumes on paranormal Bigfoot. I just wanted to flash these. Great artwork, by the way. I love the
Yeah,
I love
Tim's so great.
the illustrations.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, like
it's a pleasure to look
yeah,
at.
part of me would love to have Tim do every cover of all my books,
Yeah.
but I kind of don't want him to become synonymous with me in terms of like a branding vibe. So, but yeah, I anytime I have the chance to work with him in that capacity, it's always just beautiful. He's just released a new book on hermits, that is just
Oh,
absolutely
cool.
lavishly illustrated too. It's wonderful.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think there's anything that I mean, we kind of just hinted at a couple stuff. You mentioned some of the themes of the book. I just well for this one, just like I said that Thieves in the Night is my favorite alien abduction book. Um, I haven't read a lot of Bigfoot books, but this is my favorite Bigfoot book.
Well, it's one of those things like in some ways, like ironically, even though it's split into two books, like I don't think there's a lot to say about where the footprints end. I had this conversation
Yeah.
when we were soliciting Patrick Harper to do the blurb for it, and he said, "Great, I'm happy to give it a look. What's your thesis?" And I was like, Bigfoot's weird, like that's all I've got. Like, just
Mhm.
calling for a reappraisal, not really settling on an answer for any of these things, but just calling for a reappraisal of this basic assumption, which, we were talking about, the sort of presumptions that exist in ufology and whatnot, and like the cryptozoology is going to have a reckoning of some point at some point. Like they need to sort of like really um cryptozoology as a whole needs to have like an ayahuasca retreat. You know what I mean? Like they need
Uh-huh.
to the discipline of cryptozoology needs to go on a dieta in the Amazon and drink ayahuasca and really self-reflect about it about what it's doing and how it's perceiving the world. Because there are these sort of like colonial imperialist sort of fingerprints all over it about bag it and tag it and like, oh, we're gonna listen to indigenous testimony only as long as it flatters our own sensibilities, and as soon as these people start talking about things that are beyond the 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 biological spectrum, we're gonna be like, oh well, that they obviously don't know what they're talking about. But then as soon as they say something that
Yeah.
flatters our sensibilities, latch onto it. So like I think cryptozoology as a whole really needs to sort of do some reflection on these things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that the moment that, and obviously that's not going to happen because cryptozoology is an inanimate sort of object, but the moment that there is a critical mass of cryptozoologists willing to embrace things like psi and some of the transpersonal stuff, um,
Hmm.
I think that's going to be the moment when things like Bigfoot start to yield a little bit more to investigation because
Yeah.
we're not getting anywhere. We're just not getting anywhere. We still have a body,
And at that point, the field will then have catched up to where Keel was in the,
right,
the late
right.
60s, right?
But like I kind of wonder if that's not what all of us are doing is just catching up to Keel's
Yeah.
weird sort
Uh-huh.
of personal gnosis that he had.
Well, speaking of that, that book was the reason that I wore my Bigfoot shirt today, my To the Stars Bigfoot shirt. Do you want to see
I
that?
love it. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
It's a great color scheme too. Yeah.
So you also wrote Ecology of Souls. That's the one I don't have yet and I haven't read. But you mentioned it's kind of about death and kind of, well, again, correct me if I'm wrong. All of the correlations and connections between all of a whole bunch of these paranormal phenomena and death
Yeah,
and
yeah. I mean,
the afterlife and near death and things like that.
I think it's best told through like what I intended the project to be and what it became to give you sort of an idea
Okay.
of it. So I was always interested in that Anne Strieber quote that Whitley, this has something to do with what we
Yeah.
call death. I like to make things. I like to make things that I am interested in. I like to make my theories about the paranormal play well together, and so certain things were not playing well together and have not played well together. There's a certain internal logic between um well, if certain communities viewed fairies as the dead, um or at least having a connection to the dead, and modern aliens look so much like fairies, then there's a consistency there. Um, Kenneth Ring said alien abductions look like near-death experiences and vice versa, and meanwhile we have shamanic initiation sitting over here that is so closely tied with near-death experiences that an argument can be made that there's a lack of near-death experiences in places like Indigenous Australian testimony because they basically treated them as one and the same with these shamanic initiations. So like there's this real internal consistency of all these things circling around death. So I was just going to write a book that was going to be Death and UFOs, one little tiny book, and it ended up being about 260,000 words long. Um, and it became very apparent that not only did, to my absolute shock, did every aspect of the paranormal seems to have to touch upon death it's in some form or fashion. And I didn't really understand this, but like ley lines, an argument can be made that they are related to the dead. Ancient monuments and earthworks, they can be related to the dead. Ghosts speak for themselves, like the Loch Ness monster, Bigfoot, these persistent stories that I really didn't know what to do with of headless Bigfoot and headless aliens and alien abductees being decapitated and having head transplants. Like all this stuff started to really, I don't know if it's I don't know if it's my own biases coming into play, but all of this stuff really seemed to form a rather parsimonious picture for me. So I had two options. Like now, okay, so now it's no longer the UFO and the dead book, right? It's this giant unwieldy new mythology, as I ended up calling it. So like my two options were I could go ahead and just jump into the phenomenon, the phenomenological aspects of it, like talking about these different contact modalities, or I could sort of and then if I did that, I would have to constantly digress to explain soul traditions and wandering souls and polypsychism and all these different concepts. Or I could just be like, okay, I'm gonna walk you through this. Here are these soul traditions, the way that we've thought of this. Here are near death experiences. These are the things to look for. And now we can go from fairies to UFOs to cryptids to all this other stuff. So, um, that was the process, and I look back on it and I'm glad it's written because I would not want to write it again. It was so long and exhausting. But that's the story of that's the story of Ecology of Souls. Yeah.
Wow, cool. Yeah, no, I'll have to check that one out this year sometime, along with your new book, which I'll ask you just a little bit about. And then I just wanted to say that I hadn't read, or I haven't read, Them Old Ways Never Died yet. So this is your first novel, but I got it as soon as it came out. I just haven't had a chance to read it yet. So I started it this morning. Knowing
Oh,
I was going to
nice,
talk to you. So
nice.
I've just read the first chapter, and I've got to say, for for listeners and viewers, anyone that's interested in checking out Joshua's works, like all of them, I think you're a great writer. You're a clear writer, and you're fun to read, and you're easy to read.
Well, thank you.
No matter how kind of complex and the ideas that you're getting into, your books are just a joy to read. But I have to say that reading this one made me even more of a fan in that first chapter,
Oh,
because you're a great writer, and I was so pleased with the language, just your use of language so far. And well, I don't want to kind of insult you by saying I was surprised, like I had low
oh no,
expectations,
that's
but
perfectly fine.
you know,
Trust me. No, it's yeah, and like honestly, like so, Them Old Ways Never Died was a couple of things. First and foremost, it was a palate cleanser. Like you write Ecology of Souls, and you don't want to write another.
yeah,
You don't want to write another nonfiction book, maybe ever again. At the time, I felt like I'd said everything. Like there were a couple of weeks and months there where I was like, "Am I just done with all this?" Because like this fits
hmm
together. It works for me, right? And that's all that I really.
yeah,
At the end of the day, I'm writing this stuff for me, right? But then the other part of it was I wanted to see if a lot of my favorite fictions are ones that have something going on underneath the hood, like they've got like some sort of subtext going on, and like the monster
yeah,
is not the monster is actually something else. But I also love my monsters, as we talked about earlier.
hmm
So all that, I kind of wanted to see if I could sort of tap into this imaginal space that some of my author friends have talked about. I got a little bit of it, not as much as I'd like, but I got a little bit of that. Um, it was interesting to have that sort of ideas have those. it was interesting to invite in and solicit those ideas have people moments, right? You know,
Yeah.
those moments where you're sort of like just opening up the antenna and being like, what's going to come through. Um, so that was that, and it's a different kind of difficult from writing something like Ecology of Souls, because like if you map out Ecology of Souls, it's almost like data entry, right? Like you just gotta like find the pieces and
Yep.
put them together.
Yeah, you
But
plug it in there.
yeah, as opposed to, with a novel, you're looking at a a blinking cursor, and like there's 1,000 different ways it can go wrong. But at the same time, you're not endnoting and footnoting, which is an absolute relief.
Right.
And so my latest book that came out on the 13th of April is Fourth Wall Phantoms, with a subtitle that reflections on the paranormal narrative and fiction's becoming fact. I think I should know this, shouldn't I? Um, well,
Well, do you write? Do you write your
oh,
subtitles, or
I do write my
does your
no,
publisher do
I do write my subtitles, but it's just one of those things where it's like it's the order that I can never remember. Fourth Wall Phantoms: Reflections on the Paranormal Narrative and Fiction's Becoming Fact. And one of the things that
Oh,
I've said a couple of different things that I like to do whenever I start a new project and like what I look for, but one of the things that I do try to do in my spiritual life and my political life and my forte in life is to like really interrogate, like, well, what do you think about this? What about this? Do you really think that, Josh? Like, what about this outlier? What about this counter argument? And one of those things that I have not known what to do with for a long time are these stories of what I would call fictional incursions, which are stories where authors interact with their characters in a very tangible way. And there are varying degrees of that. I thought it was just a couple of standalone stories, like Alan Moore seeing John Constantine and Gibson manifesting the shadow in his Greenwich Village apartment. But no, it happens to a lot of authors, Nobel laureates. There's actually an entire book that I cite. Whenever you're writing a new book, for me at least, I stumble across a book that I kind of just want to copy paste into my book, not in the sense that I
yeah.
want to plagiarize it, but like I want to be like everybody needs to read this in addition. And there's this book that came out back in 2023 called Embodied Imaginations by Chidambaram Ramesh. Um, Kipling, Alice Walker, Octavio Paz, like there are all these people who have had this sort of not only the sense of of discovering the stories that they have and the characters that they have, but also um, interacting with characters that in some shockingly tangible ways. Like, yeah, they came
Hmm.
down, they came and sat on my couch and talked to me, or they I heard them say this or that or the other. And so there are all these stories of that. What the heck do you do with it? You also have a subset of stories that the ufologists like to just wave their hands and say are screen memories. Oh, it's a kid saw Donald Duck in their bedroom. Oh, it's a UFO screen memory, and it's like, okay, well, do something with that. Like, either explain what the hell a screen memory is in some sort of graspable terms. Is it tech? Is it magic? Is it like what is it? Like, just explain it or engage with it in a different way. So, um, taking this idea of fictional incursions of characters and events and things bleeding into our reality, I wanted to see what that has to say about the UFO question, about the cryptozoology question, and about the and about the parapsychological question too. And it pulled me in some interesting directions. One of the things that I think is actually has really changed my perspective of these topics is this concept of breaking the fourth wall, which is actually a colloquial way of putting it. Narratologists will call it metalepsis, but the things that basically everything that you can say about metalepsis and that breaking the fourth wall idea, you can say about the paranormal. It breaks hierarchies. It it's this awareness of being embedded in it's just an awareness that the reality in which the character is in is not real. You have authors interacting with characters, which is like divine intervention. You have characters realizing and interacting with authors, which is sort of a theurgy, right? I mean,
Hmm.
and the deeper and deeper down this particular rabbit hole you get, it's like, oh, this is the reflective factor, right? Like this is what Keel was talking about.
Yeah.
This is what people mean when they say you look at the phenomenon and the phenomenon looks back. Like that's it. And then you look at the way that, Whitley Strieber's life and body of work has changed and manifested how, you know, um he wasn't writing himself into his fiction, but the visitors were there, and now he writes himself into his nonfiction, and the visitors are there explicitly. Like it's just a lot of it's a book full of like metaphors and things like that, and open-handed concepts, right?
Uh-huh,
But
uh-huh.
I do think that this concept of metalepsis is one that's very powerful, and really, like I said, really makes me reflect on on what our reality is. One of the most the moment when I realized that I was onto something here, because this is all trickster stuff too, right? Like breaking boundaries, fourth walls, tricksters. Like this is all trickster stuff, so you can sort of pull in all that George Hansen stuff. But the moment that I was like, oh no, there is something to this, is I was reading a paper on metalepsis, an essay on metalepsis, this fourth wall breaking, that took a look at Greek art, specifically like Grecian urns, and with very few exceptions, all characters in Grecian urns are shown in profile. So they're not
Hmm.
acknowledging the viewer of the urn, right? They're looking at other characters.
Mm-hmm.
The characters who are presented face on Grecian urns, so they're looking at the viewer, are monsters, panthers, sleepers, those in altered states of consciousness, and the dead. And it's like,
Oh wow.
sounds like they kind of had it figured out. It's this idea of,
Huh.
because those are the categories, right? Like those are all of your categories.
Yeah.
Panthers are sort of the anomalous. They're the cryptozoological factor in there. But yeah, so just it's a book of art comparison and sort of raising art to a laudable position in the paranormal that I think has been neglected for some time. So
Cool. Yeah, no, I'm definitely gonna have to check that out. Um, while you were now, these probably aren't related directly to the subject or themes of your book, but you talking about it reminded me of two things. One, an interview I did a couple years ago on the channel with a Canadian romance novelist, Mary Balog. She's been writing for like, oh, I don't know how long she's been writing for, maybe 40 years. And she's kind of considered like a one of the best writers of of romance novels, right? She's a like a top-notch author. She's a good writer. She just she doesn't just put out what some might call trash novels,
right,
right?
right.
She actually has good characters and good stories and stuff. And so I was I wanted to talk to her, well, my co-hosts and and so I wanted to know what her process was, like her just her writing process and her creative process. And while she didn't talk about any materializations of her characters, she did point out that she is in the writing community. She says there are two kinds of writers. There are plotters and pantsers,
Yep, yep,
right? So there's the guys that plot everything out and then going by the seat of your
yep.
pants. And so she's a pantser. And the
That's
way she
interesting.
described it,
Yeah,
she in her head, um, she just kind of goes into this space where the characters are real, and she's basically just describing what they're doing
yeah,
and just writing it out. And of course, sometimes some things have to change, but for the most part, she's just watching the story and and putting
yeah.
it on the page.
There was a study relatively recently, at the Edinburgh Book Festival, where they asked authors these questions of varying
Yeah.
um, severity, of varying intensity, to what degree do you interact with your characters, and that was sort of like the baseline. Like, do you believe that your characters have a sense of autonomy, that they're sort of acting, and it's like 60, I think it's north of like 60% of authors feel that way, like
Yeah.
that they cede some sort of control to these characters. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
um
crazy. But then the second,
Sorry, go ahead.
or did you
Yeah,
have
no,
something
no,
else
no.
to
I was
say?
just gonna say
No.
it's
So
wild. It still is wild to me because
yeah.
I have friends who are like more or less atheist adjacent, and who are fiction authors, and even they'll say things like, "Oh, the character wouldn't let me do this." And I'm like,
Yeah.
do you hear what you're saying? You know?
Well, so the second thing was, this is just because it's related to something that I'm just researching and trying to write about right now. Um, is the abrupt appearance of reptilian aliens in the UFO literature. So I'd never really thought about it, but I was so I looked into it and I emailed Eddie Bullard to get his take on it, and he very graciously sent me like a 5-page response. I was like, oh great, that's awesome. And yeah, it's like 1989, 1990. That's when reptilians first appeared in the ufological literature. There was practically nothing before then. There were like some hints of some reptilian type things, and there were. It's not to say that there weren't accounts of reptilian beings
Right.
before, but not tied with ufology.
Right.
So you had some like cryptozoological things, like the South Carolina, lizard man, the swamp creature type things. But then you had, and Bullard pointed this out too, 1983 V.
That's
Right?
what I just plugged that into the old Google machine, and yep, V is exactly what I thought
Yep.
of. Yeah.
And of course there are some more precedents like before that. Like I think if you look at sci-fi and fantasy, you're going to find some reptilian creatures. Like I can't remember if it was George or not George Wells, H.G. Wells, or something like that. I can't remember who the authors were, but over the decades beforehand, you're going to see these presentiments or these well, also in addition to the cryptozoological ones, you're going to find just some weird accounts that could have been in the UFO literature in the 90s and a UFO count from the 90s, but they weren't. They were just kind of separate. Like, so you'll find like Brad Steiger I think I might have got this one from one of your books. Brad Steiger in like a book he wrote in '88 talked about a woman he knew. And in 1969, she had told him that she had this sexual encounter with this reptilian, like in the woods on a camping trip, and it got her pregnant, and it turned into this into this beautiful man, right? And like that's straight out of the 90s in terms of reptilian encounters. You get the nasty ones and the ones where they turn into some super hot like Nordic, right? And then they have a loving encounter, but one of the things that both that Bullard even was talking about in his write up that he did is it is kind of weird that after that introduction you do start seeing them like reptilian encounters in the experiencer abductee community.
Yeah, regularly. Yeah.
Right? Regularly. Yeah. And then you have the eternal problem with like abduction research is that the accounts start being published at a certain time. And then you have people that say, oh yeah, I had an experience like that in like the 70s. Right. It was never published, right? So you can never verify when it actually, what's actually going on.
And this is part of that cyclicality that I was getting at, like where it's like you end up going, it's
right back to the pictograph.
Yeah, it's Bertrand Mayu's territory. What he's talked about in French, and it's I don't. And so if you follow this thread long enough, like I did, you sort of wind up on this like completely unstable footing where you're like, okay, this has been fun, y'all, but like I've got to retreat. Like, I may in my heart of hearts believe, but I may in my heart of hearts believe some of these things, but I can't operate like this. Like I physically cannot operate like this because like towards the middle of the book, it's like, well, who cares if this is real or not? And no, if people believe it, then it's true. And it's like, it's fine. But as I say in the book, like you can believe these things, but you can't necessarily live by them. I can't live by them. Let's put it that way. And probably not a great idea to organize policy around it because we all have to meet in some sort of consensus, right? I don't want to impose my imaginal reality on you. So it got me into this really uncomfortable space where I'm like, okay, I've got to I want to go back to talking about like a small thing in the paranormal and look, you see this and all these other different things, and that is the end of my presentation, because it's like I'm tired of like trying to suss out the nature of reality. Let's take a step back.
Yeah, but it is fun while you're in it for the most part. Well,
oh yeah, no, it totally is
debatable.
And what's interesting too is I think I was saying this to someone yesterday that I think a lot of people in these communities don't fully grasp this inflection point that we're at right now, and what I mean by that is like ufologically, like this some really strange like generational multi or like maybe once in a generational shifts are happening. By which I mean,
Yeah.
I've always been fascinated by the way that the UFO phenomenon updates its pageantry, it updates its software, right? So you've got the airships, and you've got the saucers, and you've got
Mhm.
cigars are in there too, and you've got the black triangles, and I kept on saying like, well, it's going to be Tic Tacs, right? It's going to be drones. It's going to be drones. As soon as the Times article
Mm.
dropped, like that's so much. That's the image that everyone's been shown of UFOs for the past 8 years, right? Drones. It's going to be drones. And my friends were like, well, people aren't really seeing drones. I'm like, just wait. Like we will be seeing. And this thing over New Jersey this last year, the drones, like I had some
Yep.
people. I mentioned this online, and some people who didn't hear what I was saying were like, "But they aren't. They're terrestrial drones." I'm like, whether or not they're terrestrial drones is not the point. The fact is that people are seeing drones. They're seeing small Earth shapes in the sky, and they're saying UFOs. They're saying extraterrestrials. The image of the UFO has we are in the
Mm.
UFO drone era. Like I think that is
Yeah.
a new form that the phenomenon is going to adopt.
Yep.
Just as it has adopted black triangles, just as it's adopted the saucers. As
Hmm.
far as what that was, I still think it was probably mostly terrestrial, although I think that people were actually looking up into the sky for the first time in a long time and
Yeah.
probably seeing some stuff
Yeah.
that's always there. But like I
Yep.
am convinced that like genuinely anomalous drones are going to be a thing moving forward more so than ever.
Yeah.
That's the
Me
one
too.
thing. The other thing that I'm trying to start sounding the not sounding the alarm, but bringing some awareness to is that uh I think abductions are kind of done. Like I think
Mm.
those 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s alien abductions are kind of done. And I have some friends who work in MUFON, and this is the sense that I've been getting. But I have some friends who are part of MUFON and such, and this topic came up a while back, and they're like, "Yeah, what we're seeing is like there's still that travel element, but it's being conceptualized much more as a mental sort of travel, or as a download, or as some sort of like it's more about visitations now than it is about taking
Mm.
you to another place and physically carving you up." And I think that's interesting too. And I think that the sooner we can sort of be on the lookout for that, as opposed to a classic like lay you on the surgical table and cut you open kind of thing, the better it'll be for us in terms of being able to keep our eyes and ears open as to what this is doing now.
Mm. Wow. No, that's very interesting stuff. I'd heard a few indications of from abductees. Like one was in one of the documentaries. What was it called? It was like The Seeding or something. Extraordinary something. It was a trilogy, um, and it was they interviewed a bunch of abductees and researchers. I think maybe Barbara Barbara Lamb, Mary Rodwell.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember which, but anyways, a whole bunch of things. And a couple of the abductees said that, and I tried to find this clip again by just going through the movie, and I couldn't find it. So I don't think there's always a chance I'm hallucinating it, but that the abduction phenomenon has stopped. They
Yeah.
had said that now. And the implication wasn't that it had just stopped for that person individually, but for whole groups of people. Then, of course, I was like, well, what's going on here? I think I searched Twitter, and of course, on Twitter, you get people that say, no, it hasn't stopped, it's still going.
Or you get the
But
or
the
you get the
fact
or
that
you get the
there's
David Jacobsites who are like, oh, they've got enough that now they have enough genetic
yeah, yeah,
material. Like now they have enough.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
or yeah, I mean there are several possible interpretations or reasons for that, right? Whatever it might be, but it's still interesting that there seem to be some groups and some significant number of people that are reporting a change like that. That in itself is interesting. Um, but yeah, and then add on top of that the whole another generational kind of point is just the whole thing in Congress, right?
Yeah.
And it's been pretty interesting to watch. I mean, it would be impossible to imagine like David Grush 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, like that. something like that happening back then,
Right.
it would be more like a Bob Lazar situation, right? Where
Right.
it's like, oh well, that some people would be like, that's cool, and then it would just make no impact whatsoever.
Well, I think that
Otherwise,
this is the point that I go to. I'm at pains to sort of mention in the new book too. Is that like I don't think it's coincidental that we're having these UFO talks and that the topic is more seriously taken than it ever has been since the 40s or whatever. And the fact that like everything is reality is falling apart. like reality is literally falling apart. Like, people wanted to make fun of Terrence McKenna when his Time Wave Zero didn't pan out in 2012, but as far as he was concerned, like an ever increasing descent into an asymptotic curve of novelty, like it's spot on. Like everything seems to
mm,
be, and everything seems flipped on its head. And it just so happens to be the time when we're taking UFOs seriously. Like I think this is all part and parcel of this like trickster time that we're in.
mm,
I really do. And
cool.
it's not just on that sort of like macro level that I see it. It's also on this micro level in terms of like people on the street that I meet are much more, I'll say they'll ask me, this topic will come up and I'll be like, okay, I've got to tell them what sort of a UFO weirdo I am and I don't think that they're aliens. And before I can get that out, they're like, oh, I think they're interdimensional. And it's like
What the hell?
what what in the name of John Keel are you saying? Like, it's like the idea that that would be something that somebody in casual daily life would even be aware of as being a possibility is astounding. And
Yeah,
I think that it's just trickster times. I really do think it's just trickster times.
crazy. All right, well, Josh, I know you got to go. Or sorry, I called you Josh. Do you
That's it.
mind, Joshua? Josh?
Either one's fine. Either one's fine.
I've got a cousin named Josh, so I'm used to it. No, I've had a great time talking with you. I would recommend anyone listening or watching, if you're if you're even just a little bit interested in any of the topics that we've talked about, check out one or more of Josh's books because I enjoy all of them, and I know you've got more to come in the future of an unspecified nature of whoever knows what it is.
Yeah, well,
so I'll be watching out for the next big thing.
yeah, I'm working on I'm working on a book with my editor.
Secret project.
Well, I'm working on a book with my editor, Barbara Fisher.
Okay.
And it's challenging and gigantic, and I don't know when we'll ever finish it, but we're doing it. It's
Right.
something worth writing on.
Cool.
At the end of on May 17th, I'm going to be at the Trevette Clinic Parafest in Hamptonville, North Carolina.
Okay.
And that website is greatstateparanormal.com. And then later in the summer, on August 2nd, I will be at the Paracon Kansas City, and that website is paraconkc.com. And then finally, at the end of August, I will be at the Cape Girardeau Paranormal Convention in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and that website is SEMO mysticevents.com. So
Cool.
come bug me, come say hi, all those things.
All right, I'll put a link to your personal website too, and so people can check out your bibliography, all of your works there.
Thanks so much. Appreciate
Thanks
it.
again.
All right.
Yeah, it's been great.
Thanks.